Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hear me out on this because you may remember several months ago that if I was having to start talking about the murky, seedy underbelly of modern UK politics, there would be enough content on this channel to last us until the next general election. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, one of those moments came last night where, outside of the release of Lucy Connolly, that is an entire minefield to get over, and will probably be filled with as many controversies as Lucy herself got involved in. We now have to discuss that apparently Nigel Farage has unveiled his plan for the mass deportation of small boat arrivals. For those not in the know, Nigel Farage is the leader of the political party Reform UK. He is the MP for Clacton-on-Sea, and, well, he's apparently also one of Donald Trump's best mates or something like that. And I would say that's all you need to know. However, you might possibly want to take a gander at this. So, Nigel Farage's plot is arrest all small boats and detain them on disused military bases until deportation, sign return deals with countries including Afghanistan and Eritrea, run 5 deportation flights a day with an RAF Voyager on standby, use British overseas territories like Ascension Island as fallback sites to house migrants, create new criminal offences for anyone attempting to return to the UK. To achieve it, Nigel Farage says the UK would leave the ECHR and other treaties, including the UN Torture Convention, introduce a British Bill of Rights, and pass an illegal migration mass deportation bill. This involves having to for the British taxpayer to spend £10 billion over the course of 5 years, but he says it will save taxpayers money long term. This is from all quoted from the Times newspaper. Now, I don't even know where I'm meant to begin with this. So let's start from the beginning. First of all, arrest all small boat arrivals and detain them on disused military bases until deportation. Okay, so first thing we have to go over is that, well, this would probably involve having to recruit. I would say, because if we're going to go for the assumption that we're going to have arrests taking place pretty much all across the entire coastline of Britain, it would probably have to require something about 250,000 police officers to be ready on standby at all times, from Cornwall to West Sussex, all the way up to Northumberland. Assuming that they're going to be available on standby on every coast, or at least from the southwest all the way up to the northeast, because whether or not you want to say Wales is going to be governed or covered by police officers, owing to the geography of where they are at, is something that might have to be brought into question. How do we know that small boats won't go further, or they won't actually bypass them and enter into Wales, or possibly land on the Isle of Man, or possibly even try and go all the way as far as Scotland? Now, you may say, for a small boat to try and travel all the way to Scotland, it doesn't sound like the safest route in the world, but do you really think that's going to be brought into consideration? It will deter small boats from doing that. However, I'm not entirely convinced that even by that average, 250,000 police officers, and who on earth is going to be paying for all of these? I would say £10 billion is already well, we'll get to that in a second, but just based on what I'm calculating in my mind already. Sign return deals with countries including Afghanistan and Eritrea. Problems arise immediately because what if these two countries immediately say no to this idea? Because anyone who's familiar with the government's, the previous government's idea to send migrants off to Rwanda may remember that, guess what? Camps and bases had to be built in Rwanda, and all of them went absolutely to pot because nobody actually went over. So you're going to have to establish Afghanistan and Eritrea, and bear in mind that Afghanistan and Eritrea are not necessarily the safest countries in the world to be in right now. So what we're essentially doing is that if we were to go under the assumption that migrants coming over were already fleeing from incredibly hostile and dangerous countries, we're immediately sending them straight back there again. Suppose, and again, this is only under the assumption that all the people who are coming here were doing this completely illegally. What about the ones who were coming here completely legitimately and they had all their paperwork, they had a completely clean, a squeaky clean record, but that might be offset by something else coming up. Run 5 deportation flights a day with an RAF Voyager on standby. Few things again. Let's go back to what we said about Rwanda. All of the big airlines didn't want to have anything to do with this Rwandan scheme. And guess what? The RAF also wanted nothing to do with the Rwandan scheme. You're now telling me that they're just going to roll over and play dead just because Nigel Farage ordered them to do it. Well, what happens when they say no? Because I would not say yes to this. I mean, what's Nigel Farage planning on doing? Is he going to take on the RAF? Are you really trying to tell me that Nigel Farage is going to take on a military, like a member, a part of the Royal Arms? Are you really trying to tell me that's what's? Listen, I've had friends from school who went on to become flying officers, and and some of them have been working with the RAF for over 10 years now. Are you really trying to tell me that even because I know what these guys are like, I still keep in touch with many of them. They are not the sort that are going to in any way roll over and do this because even if the RAF say yes to this and they'll say they'll do it, how are they going to get pilots to do this? Because surely pilots, flying officers, people who work for Euro Radar or whatever, what makes you think any of them want anything to do with this? So you're going to run into a problem where, well, what happens when people just decide not to do it? Also, run 5 deportation flights a day. How much is that going to cost? You know what? We're already trying to be pretty conservative about fossil fuels at the moment. How do you think, that burning that amount of fuel is going to how do you think that's going to how is that going to work? Also, even if we were going to just jump to the conclusion that they were going to be sent to Afghanistan, what's the actual flight between, let's say, Heathrow to Afghanistan from England to Afghanistan? What's that, about 6.5 hours? So for this to work, you would need to set a flight from, let's say, midnight, and then another plane would have to leave an airport about 2.5 hours later. From an air traffic control perspective, is that sort of thing even safe? Is unless of course they go to different airports. But then how are they going to get them to go to the same sort of site or camp? How much is that going to cost? And what makes you think again the Taliban or whoever's running Afghanistan at the moment? What makes you think they're going to actually play on board with this anyway? Something tells me that this is not exact. If I can see the flaws in this, I'm sure plenty of others can see it as well. And we're not even done yet. Use British overseas territories like Ascension Island as fallback sites to house migrants. The irony about, Farage and many others complaining about housing migrants and they get nothing, when technically that's what Nigel Farage is doing, because overseas territories, well, if they are still owned by the United Kingdom, then guess what? We're still housing migrants even on Ascension Island. So go on, try and add to all the marks who defend Nigel Farage for literally years. He's still admitted that they're going to have to house migrants anyway. So how much is that? Meanwhile, create new criminal offences for anyone attempting to return to the UK. Now, what you're going to notice about this one is that this one is not specific to, or even limited to anyone not actually born in the United Kingdom. As far as we know, what about all British expats who travel to Spain to like start a new life, and even they start complaining about migrants there? What happens when they try to return to the UK? Is that are they going to face criminal charges and stuff like that? But what if their attempt to migrate is completely by the book and they haven't done anything wrong? Are they not allowed to come back to the UK? What about people who fly overseas on business? What about people who go on holiday? Or is this just specifically related to migrants? But what about even those who migrated from Britain abroad and stuff like that? And what happens if any of them try to return to the UK for any reason whatsoever? What's the charge going to be like for that? Is that even technically, is it even legal to do that? Well, according to Nigel Farage, says that the UK would need to leave the ECHR, the European Convention of Human Rights, and other treaties, including the UN Torture Convention. Now, because I don't exactly know what the UN Torture Convention is, I'm going to, however, assume for 1 second it means in the nicest bit of leeway possible. It means that we can do the idea is that we can do things like overcrowd people into a certain location, or it means we can be a little bit lax on criminals from overseas. Because I'm pretty sure there's very specific limitations about. I mean, torture by law is one of those things that it does have to be very, very specific, whether it's refusing people to, urinate or defecate, whether it's refusal to feed people. There's certain very specific ones that are technically banned under European or UN conventions. However, if supposing we are to go under the assumption that we would have to leave the UN Torture Convention, is this again that is specifically detailed to people from who are not from the UK? Because let me tell you something right now, people will take whiff of this, and there are going to be people who will start experimenting with the idea that, well, maybe we can get away with doing this because if we're not within this convention anymore, then technically through some misdevious and malicious assumption about how we access the law, the sort of things that people will be started to try and get away with, crime will escalate in cases like this. Then, of course, a British Bill of Rights. So apparently I didn't know what I was already capable of knowing, what I could do and couldn't do already. Apparently now it's got to be specifically laid out. I don't know about you, but how are you going to convince British people that that's the one in it? It's almost turning the law into a sort of a terms and conditions sort of arrangement, and I don't think actual British people aren't going to take too kindly to stuff like that, because for people complaining about the two-tier Kia system or things like, we're becoming a nanny state, well, this is turning it into a police state because from the day you were born, everything is you're gonna have to almost press a accept your terms and conditions, and then pass an illegal migration mass deportation bill. But how are you going to pass it though? Surely surely all of this, from trying to leave the ECHR, all of this would have to go into a referendum, wouldn't it? And how do you really think with someone with a reputation like Farage, with nearly 10 years of the lies and deceits and cons by Brexit, do you really think actually trying to put it to the vote for the British public? Do you really think this is a good idea? I say this as though Nigel Farage doesn't exactly have, because sadly Farage absolutely does have a very specific and a strong level of support by those who are very, very right wing. But what I am also going to add is, let's just bear this in mind, and we'll get to the final part shortly. The next general election in Britain is still 4 years away. 2029 to be exact. It might be 2030 or whatever. What I'm trying to get at is that it's still a long way away, and more importantly, even by that point, Nigel Farage will be in his late 60s by the time that happens. Now, it's true, Nigel Farage could possibly be around for as many as 20 more years, but what I'm trying to get at is that time will start working against Farage in one way or another, outside of the fact that his history is extremely controversial and a lot of his motives do seem to be very neo-Darwinistic when you think about them, through his own actions and the things he's partaken in. But what I'm trying to say in the nicest way possible, Farage, his methods will just be seen as extremely outdated, extremely out of touch, extremely unfeasible, extremely illogical, and they'll just merely result in the idea that, guess what, migrants are the result of all poverty, all crime, and if you abolish all migrants en bloc, then you've abolished all unhealthy ways of life, poverty, disease, famine. You've abolished everything all at once in the all together. But of course, anyone who is as experienced with UK politics as I am will know immediately that in the past, all of this talk surprisingly leads to very, very small results, which leads us very, very nicely into £10 billion of taxpayers' money over 5 years. This, in my opinion, is an enormous underestimate. I would say, you know what, if I'm being completely fair and honest, it would be as much as £45 billion over the course of 3 years just to get this off the ground. And by that point, well, I'm not entirely. I feel like too much money would have been spent, because bear in mind that all of this is just about how Nigel Farage is going to deal with mass deportation. At no point is this going to establish any sort of budget for any of the other things that Nigel Farage would have to be responsible for if he ever became Prime Minister. Civil engineering, architecture, schooling, um, there's too many things, because guess what? If you think Nigel Farage hasn't thought about any of those, well, he should do, because if he is that serious about this, then everything else would have to fall in line, which is also kind of concerning, because I have seen a lot of other things that are in the Reform Manifesto, if they ever came to power, in particular about what they're sort of doing in County Durham at the moment. A lot of that, if this is Nigel's attitude towards how we're going to deal with mass deportation, what he's doing for those who are born and bred British is actually even scarier. And again, ask anybody who works for Durham City Council, or anybody who has anything to do with the civil service in Durham. Well, you'll start to get a bit of an idea. However, as I alluded to before, Nigel Farage will be in his late 60s by the time the next general election comes around. By that point, this will probably would have changed to things I suggested earlier. But even by that point, you do have to ask yourself the question, if you are voting for reform and this is the only reason why you're voting for reform, you might possibly want to at least consider everything else that reform are going to try and implement and try and make commonplace and try and say that they know what they're doing. You might want to look into it a little bit harder, because if you don't do that, well, save the taxpayers' money long term, but at what cost? Because by reform's reckoning, this will already cost £10 billion over 5 years. But as I'm sure you guys are aware of, there are things out there that are slightly more costly than money, and you can't put a price on stuff like that. And finally, there's just this to be said. I know a lot of people's opinions about migration is very, very mixed, even at this current moment with everything that's been happening at Epping in this last 2 weeks. But what I've said before, and I'll continue to say it again, is that even though I personally have had no animosity and have had no issues with migrants before or hopefully afterwards, what people like Nigel Farage and many other right-wing nutters would like you to believe is that whether they are here legally or illegally, whether you know or don't know, Nigel Farage and many others would like you to believe that there is no distinction whatsoever between being here legally or illegally. It is, as they say, guilty just by association. But with all that being said and done, I'll see all of you guys again next time. Thank you.